Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. Welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads, episode 74. And on today's edition of the show, Jimmy Sengenberger is joined by Michael Barone. They'll talk about the woke anti-racism, COVID-19, and 2020 conventions. That's all coming up. Jimmy at the Crossroads, episode 74. Stay tuned.
And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they want to understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, bringing you engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style, and also doing our level best here to make sense out of nonsense. And there is so much nonsense going on across the country and the world. It's tough sometimes to make heads or tails of it, but we shall try, and in just a moment with none other than Michael Barone. Good to be with you today, and as always, want to remind you, please, if you have not done so yet, subscribe to the YouTube channel, Jimmy at the Crossroads, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. Also follow me on Twitter at Sang Center. That's Sang with an E, not an A, Center, on Twitter and on Facebook. Jimmy Sengenberger, media personality. Facebook.com/Jimmy Sengenberger Pro. And of course, the website, jimmyatthecrossroads.com, where we've got all sorts of goodies for you right there, including content, the opportunity to join my Crossroads Club membership program, and more. And it's always great to be with you here on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. And today, I want to get right to it. It is Washington Examiner Wednesday. And of course, on Washington Examiner Wednesday, we like to check in with somebody from the Examiner, our partners there, to talk about issues of the day, what's happening on the international, national, local, whatever stage that's catching the attention of the public at this point in time. Of course, the website for the Washington Examiner is WashingtonExaminer.com, and I always encourage you to like, subscribe, and follow on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter for the Examiner as well. Today, our very special guest is none other than the man I like to call our one-man political almanac, and also is, of course, the senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner. Michael Barone joins us once again here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Michael, good to have you, sir. How the heck are you?
Well, doing as well as can be expected, given the news that we've been having to deal with and the confines of an unexpected pandemic.
That is true. It is always a struggle for everybody, but we have to keep on trucking through it. So I just want to ask you a broad political question for a moment. By the way, the reason why I call you One-Man Political Almanac is you helped write what book, Michael Barone?
The Almanac American Politics, first edition of which came out in November 1971, some years ago. And worked on that for about 40-some years.
Remarkable.
900,000 words in addition, so whatever. That was
precisely. So,
yeah.
with that said, I want to remind folks of that. So, in terms of this era, this point that we're in American political history, it's very unique in a lot of different ways, but still has resonance with historical events. People have been talking about the 1960s and the unrest that we saw then. We've seen discussions about the 1918 pandemic and what have you. How would you encapsulate this political moment that we are in 2020, Michael Barone, in a historical context?
Well, it's, you brought up the parallel with the 1960s, and I remember that era quite well. In fact, I was working as an intern in the mayor's office directly with the mayor of Detroit in the summer of 1967 when we had a riot that killed 43 people, violence that destroyed commercial frontage housing and things in Detroit to an extent which has never been fully repaired, and sent that city on a downward spiral that it only just started to recover from in the last several years. So, it seems like the supposedly saying of Yogi Berra was deja vu all over again. We're hearing complaints that the death of this suspect in Minneapolis shows that Black Americans are treated as badly by the police as ever. Simply isn't true. It has evoked, however, a kind of religious relationship. The linguist John McWhorter has written well about this, Walter Russell Mead in the Wall Street Journal, a kind of anti-racism religion in which has elements of original sin, of begging forgiveness, of ritual atonements, and so forth, that supplies for many people the kind of satisfactions and explanation of the cosmos that they have a yearning for. I see people trying to satisfy their yearnings in certain ways that go beyond what we've seen in the past. We had the riots of the 1960s. We didn't have the element of Democratic members of Congress putting on kente cloth, of people in Bethesda begging and kneeling and begging forgiveness, white racism. We hadn't seen those kind of elements in the past. And in the relationship to the pandemic, we lived through about 2 to 3 months of lockdown to varying extents, depending on what part of the country you're in, whether you're in an urban or rural setting. It's interesting to compare that. We had something called the Hong Kong flu in 1957-58. We had Asian flu in 1968-69 during the same period. Then we were having riots in the streets of many American cities at that time. But we didn't try the lockdown. We didn't seem to feel that we had the capacity as a society to simply shut down very large parts of the economy, confine people to their households and to grocery shopping and a couple of other supposedly necessary activities. It's a society that feels that it can do things which past societies didn't really feel capable of. And I fear that it's setting itself up for failure, attempts to achieve things that even this sophisticated and advanced society can't really achieve.
Yeah, going back to your point here, Michael Barone, our guest senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner, about the new religion of woke anti-racism, I want to read a passage from one of your recent columns on that very topic. You point out that the linguist John McWhorter elaborated on this theme in The Atlantic. Anti-racism, he wrote, is a profoundly religious movement in everything but terminology. McWhorter likened the notion of white privilege to original sin, argued that the hope that Americans will, quote, come to terms with race is as vague as hopes for Judgment Day, and observed that the faithful on the lookout for, quote, that which may be blasphemous resort to social media shaming tantamount to the excommunication of the heretic. And you go on this, but what's interesting is that this is language that McWhorter and others like Andrew Sullivan were writing about a couple years ago. This was 2018. This was not 2020 yet. It really captures this sort of fervor that we're seeing across the nation right now. And you also go about this in your piece. You talk about science, a sort of religion of science as well. So you've got this woke anti-racism sentiment, but you've also got this scientific ideology that is very much religious in nature in a lot of respects. Talk to us about those things.
Well, you have people who, one of the things that we've seen in public opinion polling is declining percentages of people who say that they're religious in terms of standard religious denominations, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, whatever. We see more people. You do see more people moving from religious sects that don't ask very much of their believers to those that do ask a lot in terms of belief and in behavior. But you also have a falling away, a willingness to say you're an atheist, you're an agnostic, you're secular, and so forth. Politically, these people who take this view are highly correlated with the liberal side of the Democratic Party, though not every one of them is. It's, the one is reminded of the remark attributed apparently erroneously to the British writer of a century ago, G.K. Chesterton, a man who says he doesn't believe in anything. A man who believes in nothing will believe in anything. And one of the things you see in public opinion polling is that those who don't have traditional religious beliefs will tend to are much more likely than other Americans to believe in astrology, to believe that there are stones that have characteristics. What are the rocks of Sedona, Arizona, and things that have emanations and so forth. These same people say they believe in science with a capital S, but like many people on all points of the political spectrum, they tend to emphasize the parts of science that substantiate their normative beliefs rather than to avoid mention of those which tend to undercut them.
Yeah, and in terms of science, one of the things that I think they forget or ignore conveniently is the idea that putting science to work. So, for example, in terms of the coronavirus crisis, we have seen politicians say, well, the science tells us this. Well, okay, science can inform you as to the gravity of a situation, what's causing a certain pandemic to spread, and what have you. But science cannot reason through that to a public policy solution. Public policy is a little different from just looking at science, and the science in this case is only as good as those who are using the science in order to effectuate public policy. And this notion of science as sort of a capital S religious sort of idea, as you're talking about, I think gets to the heart of how one could say, well, the science tells us this, therefore we must do that. But that is not just a logical A to B type of scenario, is it?
And this is a novel coronavirus, and as the experts, the ones that I've listened to, tell us we don't know everything about it. And I mean, one of the lucky things we have in America, we have people like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Brooks, who appear to be, of all the people in the world, as expert as we could possibly hope for, and people in official positions. They've been advising the president. They've been speaking to the public. Their voice and advice has been heard, but they haven't always been right, as they admit. Dr. Fauci in January was saying it looks like this is not a pandemic. Turned out to be wrong. We had people assuming that initially that the ventilators in hospitals would help people with respiratory difficulties breathe. Turns out they tended to kill most of the people that they used. Didn't work with this virus as it has with sufferers from the influenza virus and other things. We have learned that the fears that doorknobs would carry the virus for long periods of time simply turn out not to be true, and that the virus is largely spread indoors. We've had people, public officials who say we're following the science. Don't go outdoors. Don't go to the beach. Don't go, out. It turns out this virus doesn't virus is out. So we learn by doing. It was pretty obvious from the beginning that this virus had a particularly negative effect on elderly people, and particularly those with so-called morbid technologies, high diabetes, gross obesity, things like that, comorbidities, other illnesses. And yet we had Governor Cuomo of New York, much praised by many people. On March 25th, Governor Murphy of New Jersey, at just about the same time, Governor Newsom of California, Governor Whitmer of Michigan, ordering patients identified as being infected with coronavirus to be admitted to nursing homes. In New York, they could not be barred. It was written as a sort of discrimination case. The nursing home can't even test people to see if they have that when they're being admitted there. Well, what was that? That was done out of concern, apparently, for keeping hospital beds, intensive care unit beds open. But turns out, obviously, in retrospect, that was a mistake. Contributed majorly to deaths. Perhaps as many as 40 to 50% of deaths in the U.S. have been attributed to nursing homes. Governor DeSantis of Florida kept people that were identified as being infected with the virus out of nursing homes and provided other facilities for them. That turned out to be much better, and I would say Governor Newsom in California revoked his order after 10 days, apparently decided that it was not a good idea to put infected people in nursing homes. Governor Cuomo did not do so until May 10th, and he still won't admit he made a mistake.
Again, Michael Barone is our guest, senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner, joining me here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Speaking of coronavirus, one of the things that we're seeing right now across the country is a spike in Florida, in Arizona, in Texas, and California. Several states, particularly with larger populations for the most part, are seeing these upticks, but also particularly hot places where people feel more desire during the summertime to go indoors, which, as you pointed out, is the primary place where this kind of virus can spread. Well, one of the implications of this is, and there's a headline here from the Wall Street Journal, coronavirus concerns follow RNC to Jacksonville. And it talks about how the Republican National Convention, which is supposed to be set up now in Jacksonville, are doing a couple of different events in different places, but they're rethinking, or going to have to rethink, how they go about these in-person events, most likely, especially because of the spread of this virus in Jacksonville, Florida. We already, or in Florida rather, and we already know that the Democrats are planning to hold their convention predominantly electronically, so remotely from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I want to put this into historical perspective because we haven't seen anything like this before. And I'd love for you to speak a little bit about what's going on here as you view it, especially from a historical perspective, vis-a-vis these national conventions for the two major parties in 2020.
Well, this is one issue where it seems to me that the Democrats are headed towards the right, and the Republicans are maybe making some major mistakes here in response to the coronavirus and with the national conventions. I have attended in one way, shape, or form 24 Democratic and Republican national conventions dating back to the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. They had terrific weather. They also had a certain amount of bloodshed and a certain amount of rioting and things out of control at that convention, and tumult in the convention hall. The conventions changed their character. Then changing it just about the time that I started in 1968. Historically, the conventions, which date 1832 for the Democrats, 1856 for the Republicans, with the Whigs having several conventions from before 1856. They were a communications medium. The only place where politicians from the different state political parties could get together, negotiate, and choose a candidate for president that was, because of the constitutional framework, the one sort of nomination that really defined the party nationally. And that, they became, nobody knew how many delegates anybody had. Nobody knew until the call was counted. As late as 1960, John nominated by the Democrats. I remember watching that on television, and they're in the alphabetical roll call of the states, and he doesn't get over the top until Wyoming, the 50th state, the last one on the roll call. The announcers didn't know whether or not he was going to make it at that point. The conventions were changed. They lost their monopoly of political communication by technological developments that take place in the 1950s. Long distance telephone, direct distance dialing. Before about 1957 in most United States, you couldn't place a long distance call from your local telephone. You had to call a long distance operator and then wait for her. It was almost always a her to respond. Men of business, the few women of business, didn't talk to each other by long distance phone. It was real expensive. It was clumsy and difficult to do. They didn't do that. We also got jet aircraft in the 1950s, passenger aircraft across the country. So the convention used to be the only place that politicians met and really communicated in a way that was frank and open between each other and really negotiated. Jet aircraft, long distance phone changed that. And the network coverage changes that. 1968 was the first delegate count by a television network. CBS News, Martin Plissner, counted the delegates and how many delegates supported each candidate. Nobody knew this before 1968. People were wildly wrong about the number of delegates that were committed to a particular candidate. That also changed. So the conventions became, by the 70s and 80s, television programs in which the nominee tried to show off to best advantage at a time when most television markets were dominated by ABC, NBC, CBS, and they all broadcast the conventions on the prime time, 8 to 11 Eastern in the evening on all three networks, and viewers didn't have much choice. They were locked into watching the conventions. And you saw great surges of support often from people for a convention, for a candidate of a party who was presented at the convention, the bounce, as it was called. 21st century sees some changes in that. We got a proliferation of television stations and choices. We don't get as many people watching the conventions, even the nominee's speech, as we used to. And the convention audiences tend to be tilted towards supporters of a particular party. Donald Trump was watched mainly by Republicans and Republicans of the ilk that like Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton was watched mainly by Democrats and people that tended to like Hillary Clinton. That was, the case in 2016. You don't see the bounces off the conventions because you're not exposed most voters don't use much in the ounces anymore. They can hurt a candidate, can't particularly help them. So I think the Democrats, are making a decision of saying, well, we'll present our little television show and our side voters watch it, and we'll try to make a little news. We've got a mostly sympathetic news medium and see how that works out. Donald Trump is determined to speak, it seems, before a big in-person audience. But when in an era when we're supposed to do social distancing, and I think this is one thing that the science has got right, and we're not supposed to listen to people cheering and singing songs and hurling spittle in the direction of people that are standing right next to them. And I can tell you that, having been on the convention floors many times, you can't move. It's very hard to move on a convention floor.
In fact, let me add. If I could contribute, in 2016, I was an alternate delegate to the Republican National Convention. I did have a couple of opportunities where, an actual delegate would say, hey, do you want a chance to go down to the floor? And so we switched badges temporarily, and so I went down on the floor, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it is jam-packed. And also in the upper levels for alternate delegates and other guests and what have you, it is very packed. So it's not something where you can easily just space people out and say, hey, let's try to meet any of these social distancing requirements. So
no, I mean, you get jostled and you get from one delegation to the other. It could take you 15, 20 minutes. I remember seeing the CEO of General Motors on the floor of a convention. I think it was the 2004 Republicans, and he was kind of looking, what is this? There are all these people around. I wasn't being treated like a CEO. And I turned to him, I said, Mr. Smith, I said, hey, you're on the convention floor, man. This is not CEO land anymore. Trump will get all sorts of comments from the press, which he almost always does, for doing this. But I don't think he'll get the positive bounce because he's not going to be non-committed voters, not going to be turning in voters that can't stand Trump or are on the fence, probably not going to be watching. Viewership is down. And the conventions no longer serve that unique communications medium, and they have lost the audience of movable voters at a time when there were fewer movable voters than there used to be.
Michael Barone, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner on this Washington Examiner Wednesday edition of the program. Final topic for you before we let you go, Michael, since you just led into some of the political dynamics. How do you think 2020 is shaping up from two particular standpoints? One, Trump versus Biden and the president's reelection bid, which looks very tough. And then also the United States Senate and House of Representatives. What are your sort of big picture assessments at this point as we go into the month of July and the second half of the year?
Well, I think a lot of the Democrats are licking their chops right now. We've been existing for the last 25 years or so, since the middle 1990s, in a situation where the two parties' constituencies are pretty closely balanced. It has also meant that parties, activists, party leaders, party elected officials can have reasonably hope that they're going to get a trifecta at the federal government, that they're going to get the presidency, the Senate, the House, all the things are going to line up. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way. We have divided government about 2/3 of the time, but we have had periods where the parties have gotten all three things, and the Democrats think that they might do that. I mean, President Trump has emerged from the coronavirus period with a diminished job rating. I think the idea that when we're facing a virus, a pandemic, when we're facing violation, he's going to go after whether or not the death of one of Joe Scarborough's congressional aides in 19 years ago, and he's going to go tweet about that as sort of a huge wrong footing of the nomination. And we've got Joe Biden. He's going to be 78 years old when he's inaugurated, if he's elected president next November. That's basically the same age. That's older than Ronald Reagan was when he left office after 8 years, the oldest president in history. So I think it's kind of bizarre that we've had two septuagenarians competing and apparently winning the party nomination. The Democrats have a chance to pick up the U.S. Senate. The concatenation of states that have seats up this year tends to give them many more targets than the Republicans have, and you've got some problems there. The House of Representatives, I think Democrats are favored to keep their majority, though I think that's not inevitable. So, yeah, they're hopeful. The one thing I think that to keep in mind, and to compare this with the political standings in January, when it didn't seem nearly as likely that we get a Democratic trifecta, is that things can change. Events can happen. You've got a character, Joe Biden, currently 77 years old, has some cognitive weaknesses that have appeared. I first interviewed him in May 1972, so I've had a long experience interacting with him over a long period of time. And, if I'm missing a step now, he's missing a step now. And I think that, that could have negative connotations, or ham-handed attempts by Donald Trump or Republican supporters to attack him could have a negative consequences for them. So, there's some factors that remain undecided, and we didn't know we were going to have a pandemic in January. Dr. Fauci didn't think we would, probably the world's greatest expert. So who am I to say what's going to happen between now and November?
Yeah, you never know. I remember shortly before the November 2016 election, you weren't so confident that President Trump then candidate Trump could pull it off, because that was just so unusual what was going on in that cycle. 2020 is so unusual. I mean, this is one of those situations where it's like, can you really make a reasonable prediction at this point? Or even come October, I'm not so sure that's possible.
Well, I used to say, make a little comment in some of my speeches when people expected jokes. I said, the good news is that we've got two baby boom generation candidates now, arguably, or even older in Joe Biden. The good news is that I'm going to die about the same time. That used to get a good laugh. It doesn't.
Michael, can you actually repeat? Anymore. I couldn't get a laugh. You cut out for a moment. I apologize. So please tell the joke again so we can get a good laugh.
Well, the basic, I used to say a joke that the good news is that the baby boom generation is going to die out. The bad news is I'm going to die about the same time. And that used to get a pretty good laugh. I think with Joe Biden, arguably of the baby boom generation, perhaps a little older, depending on how you date it. Donald Trump, our third president, born in the baby boom year of 1946, running with the different weaknesses that each of them has. That joke isn't very funny anymore, and it's looking a little more bizarre for a combination of two-party candidates. So that's what the 89th and 90th national conventions are going to give us, and we'll see what we get in November.
Well, it was so strange, as I remember 2016, there was all this young blood up on the stage in the Republican primary debates, and then you had all these younger Democrats that were up on the stage in the Democratic primary debates, and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And then it happened to be Joe Biden that becomes the nominee, and of course, President Trump's running for re-election, and we know that he won in 2016. It's like basically saying, nope, you got to wait a little longer. Gen X in particular. We might find that the next generation is millennials that become president, and he skipped Gen X.
Well, Gen X has Gen X candidates defined as people born after 1962. At least by my definition, got 37% of the vote in the Republican primaries and caucuses in 2016. In the Democratic primaries and caucuses of 2020, they just got 4% of the vote. It was Pete Buttigieg, Tulsi Gabbard, and Andrew Yang were their the Gen X people. So it's not clear that Gen X is ever going to get there at this point.
Harris and Booker both fit in there as well. Did you mention them?
Well, you could put Harris and Booker
Several
in
do.
there, but you're
Yeah.
still looking at a pretty low number of people.
Sure. Michael Barone, always fascinating, the one-man American political almanac, senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner. Thanks so much for joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads for Washington
Good
Examiner
to be
Wednesday.
with you. Take care.
You
Good
as
to
well.
be with you. Take care.
Be well, be safe. Michael Barone joining us here on the program. Always great to check in with Michael, and I appreciate him joining us here on this Washington Examiner Wednesday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Well, that is it for us today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Please be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not done so already. YouTube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. Become a member of Jimmy's Crossroads Club, members.jimmyatthecrossroads.com. You can shop on JimmyAtTheCrossroads.com. So many things going on, so many things to check out. You can keep tabs of it there. My thanks to Michael Barone, to the Washington Examiner, to producer extraordinaire Nathan Matoush, and of course to you for watching, listening, subscribing, and joining. Thanks for joining us. Have a great time, and God bless America.